Dr. Sofia Torallas Tovar to the Hyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. Dr. Torallas Tovar is a tenured researcher at the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in Madrid. Most of her academic training developed in Madrid at the Universidad Complutense, where she got her BA, MA, and PhD in classics, specializing in the works of Philo of Alexandria and writing a dissertation about his treatise, the Somnis, for which she was awarded with a prize for her outstanding research work. She has held postdoctoral positions at the Institute for Classic Studies in London and the Instituto de Filología belonging to the Centro Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in Madrid. She has also taught at Malmö and Stockholm in Sweden and at the University of Chicago, where she is currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Classics. Let me begin by saying that it is not easy to attempt to put under just one single category her impressive scholarly work. Dr. Torallas Tovar is a trained philologist and a curator of manuscripts. She is a specialist in classic languages, a translator, and also, I would say, a bit of a historian. As a philologist, Dr. Torallas Tovar has worked, among others, on the group responsible for the edition of a collection of papyri at the library of the Abbey of Santa Maria of Montserrat in the province of Barcelona. Her work focuses on the collection owned by the Roca Puig Foundation, of which she is as well the main curator. Through the study of this collection, composed mainly by Greek and Coptic texts, Dr. Torallas Tovar, in conjunction with a team of scholars that she has worked with through the years, has done important contributions to the field of biblical studies. As a linguist, one of her main interests has been to establish the linguistic boundaries of Coptic, especially in terms of the presence of Greek vocabulary in Coptic. She has addressed this presence in the recently published article, What is Greek and What is Coptic? The originality of this study relies on the fact that she focuses on the varying lexical position of Greek words in Coptic texts, rather than adopting a perspective that contemplates exclusively the phenomenon of assimilation of foreign words in Coptic. Also remarkable in this aspect is her grammar of Sahidic Coptic, published by the Centro Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in 2001. As a translator, she has published Spanish versions of Strabo, of several texts by Philo of Alexandria, and the Gnostic Gospel of Judas. As a historian, she has focused on different social institutions in the Hellenist period in Egypt. In several articles, Dr. Torallas Tovar has explored issues such as marriage, law enforcement, punishment, violence, and/or the symbolic terminology associated with monastic garments and the way they are described in the texts. Taking advantage of her keen eye for small theological and textual details, she is capable of elaborating such materials in order to bring to the reader a vivid painting of a period that, if it may have been an uncharted territory for many of us before this session, will not certainly remain unknown after her talk. Among many other honors, Dr. Torallas Tovar has been elected correspondent member of the Academy of Buenas Letras in Barcelona, and she has also held talks and collaborated with research groups in universities all over Europe, such as Oxford, Cambridge, Rome, Pisa, Münster, or Lyon, and in the US, such as Chicago, Michigan, Ohio State, California, Santa Barbara, and now proudly Columbia. Wisely, she has asked us to read for this evening a group of texts that encompass many of her interests, since they deal with questions of political violence, how history is written, and the construction of the canonical text of the Bible. Without further ado, I ask the public of the Hyman Center for the Humanities to warmly welcome Dr. Sofia.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking Jesus and the Department of Iberia and Latin American Studies, whatever, for inviting me not only for the 3 wonderful days I'm going to spend here in New York, but also for inviting me and thus opening a window into ancient texts in a conference which is mostly centered or focused on medieval Spain and so on. I don't know if I was successful in making my talk I don't know, useful for as a means of comparison in this conference, but at least I hope it is interesting. It is the first time in my life I haven't printed on paper. So I hope this will not be a complete disaster. At least it's ecological. So I have chosen to, like, instead of looking at how the Jew was seen in the eyes of the others, I have chosen to look at the other side of the coin and try to see the representation of the Greek other, of the opponent, in the eyes of the Jews in Greco-Roman Egypt. For the Jews after the 4th century CE, but before the Muslim conquests, the figure of the other was more or less unified under one faith, the Christian faith, which for all its internal fragmentations was represented as a unified opponent. But before this time, the panorama of religions encompassed within the Jews' other was rather a colorful mosaic. The idolaters differed in language, culture, and their gods were many and variegated. In their contact with these different religious traditions, the Jewish communities of the diaspora probably had a range of reactions which are hard but not impossible to trace in the ancient sources. Their relationship with these religions was not necessarily one of opposition, but often of tolerance and even exchange. What I will try to do today is, on the one hand, to limit my query to Hellenistic and Roman Egypt and Alexandria, the place where the two basic texts I will talk about come from, and to outline the view of the cult and the follower of Dionysus in Judeo-Hellenistic literature, as the Greek other in these two works, in Maccabees and Philo's work against Flaccus, and to try to place that view in a wider context, in the attitudes towards the cult of Dionysus in Judeo-Hellenistic literature. My goal is to show how the figure of the other as a follower of Dionysus in Jewish texts functions as an element of self-definition of the Jews themselves. Both the expounding of negative and of positive features of this cult and the warnings against it reflect changes in the Hellenistic Jewish identity and will help us reconstruct stresses and anxieties within it. The historical context plays an important part in the increasingly negative view of mystery religions, and I shall attempt to address that context, although the task is complicated by the fact that most works I will mention today have a very controversial date. Egypt provides a very interesting laboratory to understand the dynamics of the representation of the other, since it provides an exceptional advantage, the preservation of texts, both literary and documentary. And to this I may add that the fact that Septuaginta, the first Greek translation of the Old Testament, was produced in Alexandria in the 3rd century. That translation itself can already serve as a source for Hellenistic Jewish representation of the non-Jewish neighbors. The 3rd book of the Maccabees is one of the books of the Old Testament which was not translated from a Hebrew original, but was rather originally written in the Greek language in Alexandria, probably in the period between the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century of our era. It starts with the events following the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE, fought between Ptolemy IV and Antiochus III. After the attempted assassination of Ptolemy IV, in which a body double replaced the sleeping king in his tent in the military camp, the victorious king visits the city of Jerusalem, where he is struck by the architectural splendor of the temple. He is, however, denied to enter it, and when he insists, the people of Jerusalem respond with a dramatic reaction against the defilement of the most sacred. After the prayer of the high priest Simon, Philopator, who still insists in entering the sacred space, is possessed with a seizure from divine origin that renders him incapacitated. After this unfortunate episode, he didn't enter the temple. He returns to Alexandria. And enraged against the Jews after the events occurring in Jerusalem, he decrees the registration and servile status of the Jews of Alexandria, the Ivy Leaf sign of the cult of Dionysus, to be tattooed onto the Jews' arms, but he offers citizenship or isopoliteia, like equal rights as the other Alexandrians, to those Jews willing to abandon their ancestral religion and embrace the royal cult of Dionysus. And he says, but if any of them prefer to join those who have been initiated into the mysteries, and he says, I'm using already this terminology of the cult of Dionysus, they shall have equal citizenship, this is the isopoliteia, with the Alexandrians. The proposition, precisely because many refuse it, is the cause for Ptolemy Philopator's further decree, in which the Jews of the city and the countryside are to be rounded up for a registration, or laugraphia, and annihilated. Ptolemy's attempts at fulfilling his plans, that is to annihilate the Jews in the hippodrome with rampaging elephants made mad with an intoxicating mixture of wine and frankincense, are successively intercepted by divinely induced states of sleep, forgetfulness, and finally a visitation by the deity itself. At the end, Ptolemy is forced to capitulate to the god of the Jews, becoming their benefactor. What is interesting for us now about this text is the portrayal of the king Ptolemy IV, the opponent, as a follower of Dionysus in all the most negative features of the cult, in order to convey the work's most visible message, the superiority of Yahweh over Dionysus. If Dionysus is first and foremost the god of wine, Philopator, as his most loyal follower, is characterized and identified with the god through his taste and inclination for wine and banqueting. Ptolemy repeatedly appears in symposia and in feasts, cheering him and others with drinking. After having registered the Jews to be tortured, he, filled with exceeding and continuous joy, set up revels at all his idols. I've already mentioned problems of dating texts into historical context. This short story, though placed at an earlier historical moment under Ptolemy IV Philopator, was probably produced at a later moment when the Jewish community of Alexandria was already in trouble with both the government and with the Greek population of the city. This becomes clearer when compared to Philo of Alexandria's In Flaccum, which narrates the 1st century CE riots which broke out in Alexandria during the summer of 38 CE, when the Jewish community of Alexandria was decimated, tortured, expelled from their houses, and deprived from their property and businesses. The treatise begins with the description of an exemplary governor, Flaccus, who for various reasons is turned by the influence of the anti-Jewish faction of Alexandria into a cruel and pitiless governor who is instrumental in the persecution of the Jewish community. It all seemed to start when the recently appointed Jewish king Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, visited Alexandria on his way to Jerusalem from Rome. According to Philo, his presence in Alexandria inflamed tensions between Jews and Greeks. The word spread to the inhabitants of the city about the arrival of the king, leading to the event that would be like the spark which started the conflict. A town fool named Carabas was clad like the Jewish king, placed in the gymnasium and mocked, an episode which some have compared to the mocking and passion of Christ. Since the public mockery of an imperial appointee and companion constituted an offense to the emperor, the mob responsible for the affront blamed the Jews for the offense to escape the potential wrath of the emperor. According to Philo, the reason for the Alexandrians' mischief is because of an innate enmity towards the Jews, harbored by the inhabitants of the city, the Egyptian inhabitants of the city. It is plausible that such hatred existed, since the Jews had been supportive of the successive administrations placed as military detachments to control the native population, as for example in Heracleopolis, accessing higher administration in Alexandria, and even being considered Hellenes or Greeks with the tax privileges that means at some points. In any case, not only the native population appears as the enemy of the chosen people. A number of Greek citizens, mentioned by name by Philo, that is Lampo, Isidorus, and Dionysios, were instrumental in Governor Flaccus' conversion from an excellent governor into a fierce and frenzied adversary. When these adversaries from the strong anti-Jewish faction of Alexandria are described, there is an interesting parallel with the characterization of Ptolemy IV in his furious attack to the Alexandrian Jews. When referring to, concretely to Isidorus, he says in Flaccum 136, he says, well, I will start a bit earlier. And Isidorus was in no respect inferior to him in wickedness. He's referring to Lampo. Being a man of the populace, a low demagogue, one who had continually studied to throw everything into disorder and confusion, an enemy to all peace and stability, very clever and exciting seditions and tumults, which had no existence before, and at inflaming and exaggerating such as were already excited, taking care always to keep about him a disorderly and promiscuous mob of all the refuse of the people, ready for every kind of atrocity, which he had divided into regular sections as so many companies of soldiers. And here starts the interesting part. There are a vast number of parties, thiasoi, in the city, whose association is founded in no one good principle, but who are united by wine and drunkenness and revelry, and the offsprings of those indulgencies, insolence, and their meetings are called synods and couches, synodoi caeclinae by the natives. In all these parties, or the greater number of them, Isidorus is said to have borne the bell, the leader of the feast, the chief of the supper, the disturber of the city, and he uses the term symposiarchos and clinarchios. Let me just remark that in contrast to this, at the beginning of the book, when Flaccus was described as an exemplary governor, a good governor, he is said to have prohibited all associations and meetings, the etairias kai synodus, which were continually feasting together under the pretense of sacrifices, making a drunken mockery of public businesses, treating with great vigor and severity all who resisted his commands. And after his conversion into a bad governor, he is being in contact to all these people like Isidorus, who is really like the symposiarchos. It is clear that the enemy of the Jewish people appears portrayed basically as a drunk, permanently attending symposia, in a language which is very much related to the cult of Dionysus. In both cases, the divine intervention turns the fate of the Jews and saves them from their sufferings, punishing exemplary King Ptolemy, and even more cruelly Flaccus, who is exiled and finally dies at the hands of the soldiers sent by Caligula, but not before acknowledging that he has been wronged the Jewish community. Both recognize and regret the power of God and their mistake in treating his people unjustly. Both works were produced in a period when the relationship of the Jewish community with the Greek population and the government had very much deteriorated, from the end of the Ptolemaic period and mostly under Roman rule, when the problem of Alexandrian citizenship had placed the community in a very uncomfortable position. This historical situation explains why the characterization of the cult of Dionysus at some point was only restricted to the negative features of the cult. But looking back into the past, there was apparently a different attitude towards this religion and its cult. We know that Greek mystery cults reached the Jewish communities in the diasporas, who found them attractive and reconciled aspects of these cults with their native religion. In fact, it is no wonder. In a polytheistic world, many people worship multiple deities. For other Jews, however, engaging in the mystery of Dionysus went against a fundamental commandment, that of exclusive worship of the one and only God. It is well known that the refusal of this latter group to worship the protecting gods of the cities in which they dwelt gave rise to accusations widespread in the ancient world of the Jews' religious separatism. What is much less often noted is that many other Jews chose the path of social and political integration through the worship of local gods and participation in Hellenistic mystery cults. We find, for example, offerings to pagan gods by persons who present themselves as Jew. Like, for an example, is an inscription in Caria where Niketas, son of Jason, who labels himself as a Jerusalemite, contributed 100 drachmas to the festival of Dionysus. This situation of tolerance towards and even participation in Gentile superstitions generated a defensive reaction which can be traced, for example, in the translation of Septuaginta. The problem is, as often with ancient sources, that the scholar has to rely on scarce and succinct pieces of evidence, and as in this case on the semantics of items of terms like thiasos, telete, the verb teleomai or telesporos, which are related to the cult of Dionysus, but might as well be also interpreted otherwise in some contexts. There are now I'm going into these translations into Greek of the Old Testament. There are 4 instances in the Bible containing the condemnation of the heresies or abominations, and which are translated into Greek by using these terms related to the initiation into the mysteries of Dionysus, placing the abomination in the present and making not only a linguistic translation but also a cultural translation. The earliest one is Deuteronomy 23:17, which has in its original text, "None of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute." The Greek instead translated, "There shall not be a prostitute among the daughters of Israel. There shall be no one that practices prostitution among the sons of Israel," but it adds a doublet right after it, and it says, "There shall not be an initiate, a telesporos, among the daughters of Israel. There shall not be anyone initiated, teleskomenos, among the sons of Israel." The Wisdom of Solomon contains a condemnation of the Canaanites in 12:3-11, who are described as initiates of an association, mistas thiasu, who practice unholy rites, teletas and osios. I have made it boldface. Later on in 14:15, in a diatribe against idol worship, the terms mysteria kai teletas are used in where it says, "Now honored as a god what was once a dead human being and handed on to his dependents mysteries and sacred rites." In Kings, one King's Hebrew text is 3 kings in the Greek text. Asa rids the land of the cultic personnel and he removes the idols. And then he expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his ancestors had made. And then he says, referring to the mother, he even deposed his grandmother Makkah from her position as a queen mother because she had made a repulsive image or an idol for the worship of Asherah. Instead, the Greek text of 3 Kings says, and he removed the mystic rites using the word teletai. And the queen mother accused in the Hebrew text of making an abominable image, in the Greek version instead held a gathering or synodos in her sacred grove. Apparently, she becomes a leader of a Dionysiac Thiasos. In Hosea 4:19, the prophet accuses his audience of illicit sexual relationships, meaning temple prostitution, while the Greek translation, they are just offering sacrifices together with the initiates and using the word metaton tetelesmenon, again, the Dionysiac terminology. The first problem that underlies the use of Septuaginta is that the only sure date we have is for the earliest text that I have mentioned, Deuteronomy, translated with the rest of the Pentateuch under the reign of Ptolemy II Soter in the 3rd century BCE. All subsequent translations come closer to the period when the situation of the Jewish community is less peaceful, and we find the disqualifications in 3 Maccabees and in Philos in Flaccum. For example, Wisdom of Solomon has been recently dated even to the Roman period under Augustus, reflecting then a situation parallel to the one that lies behind 3 Maccabees and Flaccum. But there are in fact other documents that point to some exchange of Jewish and Dionysiac influences. The letter of Aristeas is a long text in epistolary format, pretended to be written by a Greek praising the Jewish religion, but in fact written by an Alexandrian Jew to narrate the story behind the translation of the Old Testament into Greek in Alexandria in the 3rd century, precisely the translation of Septuaginta. Some scholars, like James Scott, have seen Dionysiac elements in this text. Though I am not completely sure, I really believe that the letter of Aristeas portrays the Jewish religion as a Dionysiac mystery cult, which is the claim of Scott. I do think that some Dionysiac elements have seeped into it. The Torah is treated as a hieros logos, the sacred text typical of mysteries. The descriptions of the Temple of Jerusalem and of the gifts sent by Ptolemy to Jerusalem present elements like grapes and ivy, typical of the Dionysiac religion. And the description of the sacrifice and ritual which took place in Jerusalem has also some Dionysiac elements. The priests are described as tearing the limbs of a victim, which can be compared to the Dionysiac sparagmos, or dismemberment of the bodies of the sacrificial victims. The final symposium of Ptolemy and the 70 wise men who translated the Pentateuch into Greek has been also claimed to be in itself a Dionysiac element as a banquet, but not only a banquet, but a banquet held at the court of a Ptolemaic king, being this dynasty, the Ptolemies, well connected to the cult of Dionysus. Some of these kings labeled themselves as New Dionysus. I find more convincing evidence in Philo's use of the terminology of the mysteries in his works. Philo of Alexandria, whom we have already met describing in his historical treatises the enemy of the Jewish people as a follower of Dionysus, nevertheless adopted the terminology of the mysteries in his philosophical works. For example, he uses the term hierophantes for the translators of the Septuagint, being the hierophantes the one who explains the secrets of the sacred texts in the Dionysiac cult. Dionysiac banqueting also served Philo as a very convenient metaphor for divine inspiration, for drunkenness and folly produced by drinking the unmixed love of God. That would be the sobria ebrietas. Is used when comparing the community of the Therapeutai in his treatise on the contemplation, as a means to describe initiation and divine inspiration dissociated from idolatry, as a fitting metaphor for things common to the cult of Dionysus and the Jewish religion. Especially in this work on the contemplative life, Philo describes a Jewish religious community, this Therapeutai, of which his treatise is the only source, who live a life in complete virtue, abstaining, of course, of wine. In their heaven-sent passion, which induces them into a sort of frenzy, they are compared to the Bacchants and the Corybants. As for example in 85, where they say, when each chorus of the men and each chorus of the women has feasted separately by itself, like persons in the Bacchanalian revels, drinking the pure or unmixed wine of the love of God, they join together and they two become one chorus. I also want to point out here, it's interesting that while this word unmixed, referring to wine, in antiquity, people who drank unmixed wine were considered not very decent. I mean, decent people drank mixed wine. But this is used instead as a metaphor of the unmixed wine of love, like pure, used for pure, the pure love of God. As As we have seen, a tolerant and participative attitude of the Jews of the diaspora towards the religions of the others, and especially towards the mystical religions, generated first some sort of precaution, which with time became rejection, without that rejection producing any purge of Hellenistic mysteries from the Jewish theological imagination. The distillation of some positive elements of the cult of Dionysus, as we have seen in the contemplative life of Philo, remained as very useful metaphor in philosophical context, but the negative elements served too as a very effective characterization of the opponent in an increasingly hostile socio-political context under Roman rule. Let me hasten to state that I do not see the Jews considering their own religion comparable to the mysteries of Dionysus, nor even daring to compare God to Bacchus. What I do think is that Hellenistic Jews were exposed not only to the Greek language, which they learned and made their mother language, but also a heavy cultural load which came paired with the language. The terminology of the mysteries was fitting for a philosopher like Philo to explain initiation, inspiration, and the way to salvation. And on occasion, he even admitted having overdone it a bit in banquets drinking wine. The Jews of Hellenistic Egypt were exposed to a widespread practice and religion, and the danger of transfer was present from early on. The warnings are an evident proof of the danger of the existence of some Jews crossing the line. At the point when 3 Maccabees and Inflagum were produced, the same cult which loaned a befitting terminology for a Jewish mystery provided the image of the opponent in the negative features of the follower of Dionysus in the debauchery of a wild banquet. Thank you very much.
We can open the floor for some questions.
It would be interesting to try to draw the two, convert the two thoughts you and Paolo together. That is, were things different or were things the same? That is, that, Jews who, in the context of the, let's say, late Hellenistic or early Roman Greek city, who, was there a sense of their, do you think that there was a sense of their crossing the line when they did what they did? Which relates to the question of the sort of social location of the sorts of people who did it. It is, were they still Jewish? Nicaea, son of Jason of Iasos, who we mentioned, identifies himself as a hero Solomites, not as a Dryas. It's this donor to the local Dionysiac mysteries. So I just wonder, one relevant factoid is, if Jews converting to Christianity in Europe in the 12th and 13th century were socially marginal, sometimes we hear about Jews who leave behind Judaism who are not socially marginal, who are actually socially central. It's more like a 19th century model. Philo's nephew, who Josephus says left behind his ancestral customs, was a very grand figure. He was so that may point towards a kind of a different model at work. Were they different, or were they?
But I wonder if this Philo's nephew or other this I don't remember this other sort of Trivios who was in fact a priest of Alexander, if they really left behind everything, or it was only from the point of view of someone who really wanted them to practice, to observe more purely, or they just really crossed the line, but were both.
Okay, well, I don't know. Well, what's the answer?
But it's very hard to tell, because I think things like this inscription in Iasos would be interesting to explore more deeply. But the problem with Jews, with the Hellenistic Jews, is that they often use Greek names, and they are very difficult to identify unless they label themselves as Jew, because they have Greek names.
No.
Often not, but very often they have Greek names. So it is often very difficult to tell.
actually think there's a common thread between all three papers, in the sense that when you began by calling for less attention to the crossover in an attempt to focus on the individual community, then you called attention to just how impermeable the boundaries were when convicts tried to cross the communities, less focus on cultural aspects, but simply on can a convert cross or not, and what social factors impinge on that. You could point to wealth, and some very rich ones could cross. And then you point us to a world in which there are multiple registers. There are registers of people, of cultural terms and cultural content crossing. There are registers of people perhaps crossing, perhaps not. And again, their social rank might really matter in whether they seem to have crossed or not, or whether they're criticized for crossing or not. But in that sense, I really think we're part of one conversation here. The odd thing is that the people from Jewish studies are taking the position of impermeability, which, you know, you make me feel old, because I thought my generation, it was permeability was what it's all about, and the person from classics is saying there was both permeability and impermeability, and look at the registers. And I just think it's a curious shape of the conversation. That wasn't the question, I guess. I'm sorry.
You're allowed to on the radio. All right. Shall we move on? Thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure to present our last speaker for the evening, Professor David Nuremberg. Professor David Nuremberg specializes in Christian, Jews, and Muslim and medieval Europe and the Mediterranean from an interdisciplinary perspective that ranges from artistic, historiography, literary, philosophical genres, and also medieval ideas about communication, exchange, and social relations between Christian, Jews, and Muslims. He earned his Master of Arts and PhD in History from Princeton University, has been a professor at Rice University and Johns Hopkins University, and in 2006 he joined the faculty of the Department of History at the University of Chicago, where he is currently the Deborah R. and Edgar Den Jamoda Professor of Medieval History and Social Thought. He is also founding faculty director of the Neubauer Family Collegium for Culture and Society and associate of the Max Planck Institute in Berlin Human Science Section. Professor Nuremberg has also been a visiting professor in various institutions, including Consejo